Welcome to Pascal's China Lens. Yes, again. For you loyal fans who've been following me and my 100 videos online, I know I've been away for a long time. I'm going to change that. I've just released my new book. My new book is called China's Next Miracle. It took me 1.5 years to write. And this is about China in the next 10 years. And so it's a prediction I'm making, but also I'm explaining a lot about the model and about what we're going to talk about today, which is China's new master plan. Basically what Beijing intends to do to completely change how China is actually looking at its own future and creating its own future. Now, if you want to get the book, you can get it on Amazon or many sites online, but you can also just scan this QR code. I can sign it for you, send it from Belgium, wherever you are in the world, but that's up to you. But I'm going to go in the next many months in explaining chapter by chapter basically what I predict China is going to do and what's going to happen in China over the next 10 years. China going from a production society more and more into a knowledge society. So let's get into the question, what is China's next miracle when it comes to the master plan from Beijing? Well, it has a name. And the name is very clear. It's called the New Quality Productive Forces, 新质生产力 in Chinese. And many people say, yeah, this is about high quality development, it's about productive forces or quality development itself. There's a lot of words around it, but this is actually very clearly written what it means. And so very few people actually understand what this means. I give keynotes every single week, 2 or 3 a week actually, and every time I do that in Europe, to audiences of hundreds of people, I always ask the question, who knows what the New Quality Productive Forces is about? And there's seldom anybody, rarely anybody, who raises their hand. What that means is that people have no idea what China's big plan for the next 10 years is. And I believe the New Quality Productive Forces is actually a plan that could be the biggest plan since the opening of China in 1978. So let's get into it. Now, what is it? What is this New Quality Productive Forces? Well, I could explain it in much detail, but what I'm going to do here is just separate the words out. And when you separate the words out, you can really lay out that mosaic and what it means to actually understand how China envisions its own future over the next 5 to 10 years. Well, what is new, what is quality, what is productive, and what is forces? Well, it's simple. If you look at the whole thing together, it actually is a paradigm shift for higher standard output, for more efficient resource utilization in order to transform the economy. And so the big difference with the Made in China 2025 plan from 2015 is that this is really a societal transformation. It's not just about upgrading the industry, it's much more than that. Now let's go into a little bit detail, and later on I'm going to simplify it so it makes it a lot more clear. So if we go into more detail, what is new? Well, they want to build new industries, new technologies. Think about AI, think about all the digitalization, specifically in the infrastructure that has been built now. But also new business models. I mean, DeepSeek was one of these examples, and there's many more. But it's really a different mindset, a different paradigm shift that has to be driven by the startups, by the new entrepreneurs of China of tomorrow. But it's also about quality. And when we talk about quality, this is really about product and environmental, the green industry. It's also about setting standards. It's a lot about innovation. I'll talk in the next video on how China changes the innovation model and how that is really changing everything in terms of that next miracle. But it's also about digitalization and mostly about customer value. So the customer centricity is central. And this has to be driven by China's private companies primarily. And then there is the next thing, which is productivity. And that's really the most interesting part, because that is where China really wants to increase the total productivity factor, mainly make China and all the industries, specifically traditional industries, a lot more productive. With automation, with a lot of resource efficiency, with a lot of robots and AI and all that stuff. And this is where the local governments have the KPIs to make that happen by working together with the companies and with the entrepreneurs. And the last one is the forces. And what is the forces in China that really will transform the economy? Well, it's the people, but it's also the government giving R&D investment and support and policy support, but also China becoming a knowledge society from a production society. And so this all fits very well together in a puzzle that really can actually complete that story that China wants to achieve, which is becoming a real modern society by 2035. Now, let's not just talk about facts and data and stuff like that and what they really want to do. Let's go into really good examples and explain what this means. Well, if we start with new, it's very simple. What is China wanting to do new in that plan? Well, in that 10-year master plan, what they want to do is based on the new 3. And I don't know if you heard about the new 3, but it's been around there for a couple of years. And this is basically batteries, it's solar panels, it's electrical vehicles. And these 3 together has really created the growth in the economy in China. In 2024-25, almost 6% of the growth of the whole, or let's say the whole GDP value, came from these 3 economies or industries. And almost 10% of the whole GDP came from the whole renewable or clean tech industry in itself. And so what they've achieved is create a capacity, but also an innovation in these industries where the whole world is now buying from China, and it raises their GDP. And so what they want to do is now replicate this in other industries. They want to build the capacity that they've been building in the clean tech industry, which if you look at renewable energy, it's like 4 times more than the European Union over the past 5 years, 5 times more than the US, and 8 times more than India. And with Trump saying drill baby drill, it's going to just widen that gap. So it's only Europe or the EU and China really still wanting to build the capacity. But China is far out there, to that effect that today we're calling China the first Electrostate. I explained this in my book in more detail. But what it means, simply said, is like where Russia and Iran and Venezuela and Saudi and Texas and all these states are petrostates or oil states, China is becoming an electrostate, meaning they electrify the world with renewable energy, with clean energy, or at least the capacity that they sell to the world, including to themselves. And so this master plan that they've created over the past 10 years with the Made in China 2025 plan has worked so well that they now want to replicate this in different new growing industries that could grow the economy and the GDP. For example, China wants to become a mobility state. What that means is very simple. With electrical vehicles, we know, but it's not just about the batteries and the vehicles. It's also about the digital experience. It's about the self-driving experience. And in mobility, you also have the high-speed trains now going to 1,000 kilometers an hour or 600 plus miles an hour in the next years to come. This is the test that they're doing because they want to improve this mobility globally, or at least in China, and then export that globally, that knowledge, but also that capacity. So there's a lot of things going to happen in EV land, in mobility land, that we haven't seen yet happening. The next thing is, of course, they want to become an aviation state, but also a space state. What that means is we see very clearly that China has its first planes, the C919, C929, the C939. I mean, they have their planes, and now they're going to start, and they already have started, exporting them globally. But it's also about space and doing things with their own space station as well as satellites, and even have data or AI clouds in satellites and stuff like that. I mean, crazy stuff that is happening where they're trying to have the space economy become the next economy for China, even and specifically in the low orbits, meaning flying taxis. Everything under 1,000 meters is something that is a complete new economy that is taking off like crazy in China. So this is just another example. So we've seen the mobility state, we've seen the aviation state. These are new states that they're building, basically finding new markets and then growing it crazily. Things like robot state. I mean, we've seen probably, I mean, I assume you have, the dancing robots on Chinese New Year. I mean, it was crazy, the gala, in just 1 year time. The improvement in how these robots really mobilize and did kung fu tricks and jumps and all that. Well, a year ago, they were just running around with handkerchiefs and stuff like that. I mean, there's an enormous improvement in 1 year time. A company like Xpeng, they released their first robot a couple of months ago, where people, the audience, would not believe that there's no human inside. That realistic it was. But it's not just about these humanoid robots for fun, it's also for factories. You see more and more the practical uses, and many automotive companies in China are investing in the robot state or in the robot industry, just like Musk does with his own robots, which is ultimately going to be maybe the only one competing with China over time. But besides the robot, it's also something that we're not talking a lot about, but which is going to be a major shift. I believe after the whole EV market, the biggest next boom will be the biotech state. And that means that China is producing pharmaceutical products, is producing clinical trials more than anywhere else in the world, is really coming out with new patents, new drugs that the world, the Americans, the Europeans are starting to license because it's so good and we don't have that capacity, or we can't get it through regulation fast enough anymore. So China is positioning itself as the next biotech state. But it's also the microchip state. I mean, if you look at what Jensen Huang, the CEO and founder of NVIDIA, says, is that China is just nanoseconds behind the US in terms of AI. And he's not talking about software, he's talking about hardware. Now people say, yeah, but in chip industry, China is still 10 years behind in lithography and so on. But if you really look at the breakthroughs in China in 2D semiconductors, I mean, this is different from silicon wafers. I mean, China is one of the first one breaking through and making this maybe possible very soon on scale. So there's a lot of things happening. Now, we don't have time to go in all of these new businesses and new industries, but I just gave you a taste of how many new states or industries that China could monopolize or at least be the leader globally. And in my book, I explain a lot more about it. But that's the whole idea. Now, the next thing about the new quality productive forces has everything to do with quality. And you could ask yourself the question, yeah, Chinese quality, what is it? I mean, we talk about bad quality everywhere. This is something that people still feel that China doesn't have the really good quality. But we can't deny anymore that today China, specifically in the high-end products, if you look at drones, you look at cell phones, you look at cars and automotive like Xiaomi or Huawei, or you look at CATL with their fantastic batteries, I mean, we in Europe, in America, we're dependent on China in order to keep our quality high. But it's not just about quality, it's also about green. These factories are really more and more CO2 friendly or emission friendly. And what China now wants to do with this new 10-year plan, the new quality productive forces, is to not just have the top of the iceberg, the really high-tech companies to really provide this quality. They want to have all of these factories, or as many as possible in China, to raise the level of the quality. And that's where I believe in 10 years from now, in Europe, in the US, we might not be competing with China on price anymore, but on quality. Because with the 6 million factories that China has, even if it's only half of them that raises the quality to the level of the West, I mean, then I think we in Europe, in America, will have a real challenge to beat China at our own game that we started. Now, if you look at this whole new quality productive forces, it's also interesting to see that this is a societal master plan. It's not just about industry or about productivity, or about export or about jobs. No, it's really societal change. And so there's things that has to be relevant for China for the future, but also within the global environment that China lives in today. And then there's things that are existential, which China cannot say no to, because if they don't succeed there, basically the economy will never become a modern society. And then there's what we could call protectionist areas, and there's more futuristic areas. And it's interesting to then put the new quality productive forces in the right box to understand what is aimed for what. So I made it simple for you, and I've put this in this quadrant. And if you look at the quadrant, it's very clear that what is new, these new businesses which we just talked about, these new states, biotech, chip state, but also things like robots and, I mean, humanoid robots, EVs, all this stuff, this is all about China leading in certain industries like they did in the clean tech industry, specifically in capacity, but also in innovation and quality. But when we look, on the other hand, at the quality part of the new quality productive forces, this is much more protectionist. It's to protect China's industry in a global setting. This is to remain relevant globally. It means that where we in Europe, we try to protect our industry from China, China is doing the exact opposite direction. They're actually wanting to compete with us on quality. So not on dumping, not on price. And so if they raise the quality, and we can't continue claiming that China is just dumping everything into our European markets. And so this is both protectionist, but also very relevant for the future and for China in a global setting. When we look at the productivity, however, that is very much protective and very existential. Because if China cannot raise its productivity of most of its industries, I mean, it will probably have a hard time to get into a more modern society by 2035. This is about self-reliance. This is about making sure China does not have to rely on the rest of the world to keep its productivity high in its factories. And so this is happening very, very fast. But if they can succeed with that, ultimately, the biggest value that we have in Europe, our productivity compared to China very often, specifically in the industries, is going to fade away slowly. And that is something we have to watch very, very closely. And the last one is about the forces. And this is, of course, futuristic. It's about progressive. It's about tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And this is all about the people, about the R&D, about the things that, the resources that are being put in to create stuff. This is also about inventions. And this is, of course, existential, because if you have things like AI or AGI and quantum, if China is not going to make the breakthroughs, or at least go as fast as the US is, maybe the US will actually rule the world in terms of technology. So this is what I've put in a quadrant, and in my book I explain in much more detail, but this shows very simply what is futuristic, what is actually protectionist, what is actually relevant, and what is existential. Now let's go to productivity, because I think that's the most interesting topic of all four. If you go to the productivity of China, this is really existential. And this is about raising the productivity of all its traditional industries. So we're not talking about those new industries like humanoid robots or EVs, that it's not new anymore, but this is where China is really making breakthrough, or flying taxis. No, we're talking about traditional industries. These are industries like agriculture or construction, which today, if you look at agriculture, a Chinese farmer is 5 times less productive than a Dutch farmer, for example. So they can raise a lot still. Same in construction, same in a lot of hospitals and healthcare. I mean, there's cool hospitals in China, but there's also backward hospitals in the rural areas that really do not have the productivity or enough doctors or enough equipment. When you look at, for example, the energy sector, there China already raised the bar to have a smart grid, almost as smart as many places in the West. But it can still go higher, and specifically with renewables, I mean, things are going to happen over the next years. Things like petrochemicals and chemicals. This is clearly where the European Union or Europe is really worried, because China raised their productivity level. In logistics, I mean, China is way ahead of many countries in the world. So this gives you some examples of the traditional industries, but there's many more that actually, the steel industry, the cement industry, I mean, many more industries where actually China wants to raise the productivity. And if you look at that, the mistake that most of us make is look at all these cool things coming from China, but we're forgetting that the real transformation is starting from the bottom. It means the traditional industries, the industries of yesterday of China and of the world, actually they want to secure that and raise the productivity to have that as a foundation for the new industries that can then build on top of that. And of course, these new industries will feed the traditional industries again. But the whole idea there is then ultimately to have the creation of new inventions and new things, breakthroughs, in order to go and help the traditional but also the new industries moving forward. And so the mistake we're making in the West, specifically in Europe, in the US, in Europe where I'm from, is that the Western media is mainly looking at the cool new things, the dancing humanoid robots, the flying taxis, all these cool stuff that China's doing. I mean, railroads or trains at 1,000 kilometers an hour, it's all cool. But that is not where China, in this new plan, is putting all its resources. Most of its resources are put in the traditional industries to upgrade that with higher productivity, with robots, with AI, with automation, and so on. And we're almost paying no attention on that. This is our biggest blind spot we have on China right now. And the other blind spot we have is really everything that is binary. It means the breakthroughs China is doing in semiconductors and new materials, in quantum, in biotech, and all these things. We're rarely or almost never watching that either. So we have a lot of blind spots, and we're always looking at the hype and the cool stuff, but the really interesting thing and the really thing to look at for our industries in Europe is the thing that actually China is slowly but steadily changing from the bottom up. Now, if you look at manufacturing, I think this will be the biggest shock for Europe and for the US. It has already been. Most of the manufacturing is now outsourced to China. China is about 30% of the world's manufacturing volume. But this was a lot still with manual labor. But today you see all these factories becoming more and more smart factories, or even dark factories, where today hundreds of factories in China, like Foxconn and Xiaomi and BYD, they're all starting to build their own dark factories, which means there's so many robots in this factory that you don't need people anymore. You can just switch off the lights. And this is, of course, only a few hundred factories. But imagine, if only a few hundred factories today are already completely challenging the European factories, imagine if this is 1,000, 10,000 or 100,000. So that's the future we need to look at. And that brings me to the last part, the most interesting of all, which is the forces. Now, what is the biggest force that China has? Well, I think we all know the answer. It's the number of people. And that talent is now what China, in its new quality productive forces, wants to increase or augment to make society a lot smarter. Now, if we look at the data, what we see is that today already 3.57 million engineers are graduating from Chinese university every single year. I mean, that's 3.57 million Chinese becoming an engineer every year out of Chinese university. And in India, you have 2.5 million. So together, India and China is 2/3 of all graduating engineers in the world. Now, the US has 820,000, but half of them are Chinese or Indians. So it's very clear. If you challenge China or India in the future, well, asking yourself the question, could they become an innovation nation? I think the answer is very clear in front of us. There's smart people everywhere in the world. The only difference is China and India have many more smart people than many places elsewhere. It's not their fault. It's really a matter of capacity, and quality is also something that we need to take into account. Because if you look at the PISA competition or all the IQ competitions globally that are being held, it's pretty much always the Chinese or Asian countries with Chinese origin that actually win these competitions. Now, one of the main reasons is, of course, that many of these competitions are driven by science, maths, reading, things that the Chinese, as a kid, they train on. I mean, this is the left brain training that the Chinese students do when they are 6-year-old, and then it increases every single year. And if you learn to read and write Chinese like I have, I can tell you your brain really has to work. And so this helps a lot in becoming the smartest engineers in the world. And if we look at the brain of humans, we have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And neurologically speaking, we're using the left and the right in the same amount. So everybody's using the same left and right. But we all are talented a little bit more to the left or to the right. It means that some people are more artistic and creative, and other people are more scientific and maybe better at reading and writing. And so what China does is its population has the same graph as everywhere else, but they train very much the left brain. And so what China now wants to do is to basically educate 1 billion brains. And they'll start that at very young age. The whole idea here in Hangzhou, for example, the city of Alibaba and DeepSeek and Unitree, that is where already kids from 6-year-old are getting AI classes. And so every year this is going to become more difficult. So by the time they're 18, we have like 10 million, if this goes nationwide, 10 million little AI engineers graduating from high school or middle school every single year. But it's not just about the school, it's also about vocational training and upskilling people who are already in the workforce, which is a clear plan for the next 10 years that China's implementing, a little bit based on the German model of vocational training. So what we see a lot happening now is that China really wants to take this left brain education in order to make little scientists and upskilling them to be able to handle AI, automation, robots and all that stuff for the future. That is a very different knowledge society than we've known so far. And of course you could ask the question, yeah, but isn't this rat race going to end one day? I mean, can they just go on and on and on and on? And the answer is yes, it will not continue forever at the same pace. Actually today, if you look at young people in China, they don't want to run that rat race like their parents and their grandparents anymore. They want to have more grace in life. And what that means is they want to enjoy life. They want to have experiences. They want to do adventures, do creation, do art, all these things that actually are typically for the right brain training. And so here's the interesting part. Well, most of these kids, all of these kids in China, they've been trained in school very much mostly on the left brain hemisphere. Now they're getting really interested to use the right brain training or train the right brain to actually experiment different things. And it's not that one is smarter than the other or one is better than the other. It's just simply that now it's more complete in their aspirations because their parents and their grandparents did not have the time or the money or the opportunity to actually go into a lot of things that need time and room, like creativity and arts. And so this is interesting, where I feel that in Western media we're always talking about the Chinese laying flat and not wanting to work and unemployment and all these things, and we're missing the actually time opportunity that they have and financial opportunity in the middle class, which is the biggest in the world now, to actually experiment with new things. And so the thing is, if you look in 5 years from now, this rat race is still going to continue because more than 500 million Chinese of the other generation before the Gen Z are actually still willing to work really hard for their family, their kid or their parents, and work really for a better life, while the younger Chinese, they have had all that opportunity from their parents and now want to spend more time on doing things which is less scientific maybe, or less need under pressure and competition from the whole society. And so here's the interesting thing, is that many of these Gen Zs, these young people who are interested in science, who are very good at it and got trained by it, but also are very interested in creating new things, they now form what I call the Genius Z instead of Gen Z. And the Genius Z is actually a new generation of Chinese that are the creatives of DeepSeek, of Unitree, of all these companies that are 20-year-olds that nobody ever heard about, but suddenly are challenging US companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and all these guys that have the smartest brains in the world. And how can they do this? It has something to do with the completeness of the interest and the training on both sides of the hemisphere. And of course, these are the smartest people around that are creating these differences. But I'm very bullish because of that. And so I believe it's that combination of an engineering state that pretty much is trying to make a plan for the next 10 years by 2035 to create China's next miracle, and basically with the new quality productive forces to engineer their own future, combined with the young generation that is trying to do things in a different way, to do breakthroughs, to do disruption, basically to go to that next level from the bottom up, with gaming, with consumables, with collectibles, with things like sports, with things like movies, short dramas, all these things, it's cool things, fashion and so on. This is the new China with the young generation that is going to surprise the world. And I believe believe the biggest blind spot that we in the West have or will have in 10 years from now will be the fact that we will not have understood why China and how China, from an engineering mindset, has created a creativity environment and society that really is challenging the creativity globally. And so I believe China is very well positioned to create its next miracle. The plan's there, and we should all at least know the plan. Whether they can realize it or not, that is a different question. But if we know the plan, and if they do realize that plan, I believe in Europe, in the US, anywhere in the West, we need to be ready, because if this becomes a reality, it means the quality of the Chinese products, the quality of the Chinese creativity, the productivity of the enterprises, the disruption that will happen as well in traditional and in new industries is going to be a completely new paradigm shift that is going to transform the Chinese economy. And so we need to be ready for that. Now, I hope you like this video. I'm going to make many more from my book. This is the first one for chapter 3, but I have another one coming up on innovation model and how China is completely redefining the innovation model on a global level, and what that means for our companies here in Europe, in the West, anywhere outside of China. If you like my book, if you like my content, you can get my book. You can scan the QR code, but definitely keep following me on YouTube. Subscribe if you haven't done so yet. And if you have, keep following all my YouTube videos, because there's a lot to come. There's 8 chapters in my book, and this is just the beginning.